Welcome back to the Watches and Style channel. This is your host, Young Brando, live from Los Angeles. We're going to do something a little bit different today. As you can see, I'm trying to increase the number of early shows so I can be live at a more reasonable time for my audience in continental Europe, in the UK, and even in other parts of the US. It does involve a little bit of a sacrifice. I do need to set aside 1 or 2 hours of my time in the middle of the day, and I'm going to try to do it without taking away from the late night show that a lot of people love and follow. So we are trying something different, but I think it's necessary because I do want to expand the channel. I do want to grow the channel. I do want to have a bigger audience. That's my main goal for this summer. So I'm going to push it as far as I can, as much as I can. And I'm sure with your help, I can get quite far. We're going to do something a little different today. I have in the past done watch-alongs of interviews with certain figures in the watch market, in the horological world. As you guys know, I'm always a big fan of what Waco does at the Revolution Watch channel, which is a very organic outgrowth of what he has been doing with the Revolution magazine over the years. And since the beginning of this year, he has been releasing part by part this extended retrospective interview that he has done with François-Paul Journe in Geneva. I've had a previous episode which was very long and extended, where I went through the first 2 parts. If there is a demand in the audience today, I can start from scratch. Today, I thought I would just focus on the 3rd part, which is just 15 minutes, and which is something I can tackle in this hour and a half that we have today. But yes, if there's any demand, I will happily roll back the tape and start from part 1, and maybe we'll have something more coherent where I will go through it. The translations are there, so it's not like this is a kind of topic or conversation that you can't tackle on your own. But once every so often, I try to provide some extra detail and illuminate and add my own commentary, which I think is helpful. So let's just start things off. I also wanted to let you know that I did an extensive review of the results from the Art of FB Journe auction from Christie's Geneva from last week. This was an historic event, of course, recognizing François-Paul Journe's contributions to the horological world, to the avenue of independent watchmaking. It was the first extensive, dedicated curation that Christie's did for a living independent watchmaker. Very significant, so check it out. I think it was quite comprehensive and relatively compact for its size as well. Hey, Basil. So nice to see you, man.
Est-ce que c'est vrai que le chronomètre optimum, c'est déjà dans votre tête pour beaucoup des années?
Wei asks, is it true that you have been working, you have had the idea for chronometre optimum in your mind for quite some time, for some years.
Depuis 1984.
Wow. So, à la même moment que le tourbillon et, et la
parce
résonance.
Que quand j'ai fait le remontoir d'égalité, pour sa première montre, je m'étais dit, ma prochaine montre que je vais faire pour moi, si j'ai le temps, en montre de poche toujours à l'époque, ce sera double barillet, remontoir d'égalité et échappement sans huile, je pense.
So most of this conversation is about chronometry and especially François-Paul Journe's conception of the chronometre optimum. So he starts by saying that he had the germination of the idea in 1984, right around the same time when he made his pocket watch tourbillon, because he wanted to have a watch that had a remontoir d'égalité, that had double barrels and an escapement without the necessity of oil. He said to himself at that time, if I ever have time, that is the next watch I will make for myself. I guess life got in the way, and in the best way. The rest is history, but it took a while for him to realize the project. So he's going to talk about how he came to the ultimate wristwatch version.
C'est peut-être un échappement de Robin ou un truc comme ça. Ouais. Après, ça a évolué. Puis, en 2001, j'ai dessiné l'Optimum.
So he said he wanted basically an escapement that wouldn't need oil. He says maybe the Robin escapement or something like that. I didn't know at the time. The idea continued evolving, and I basically came up with my design for Chronometre Optimum in 2001.
Wow, en 2001.
Incroyable.
Et quand j'ai dessiné l'Optimum, je me suis rendu compte que je pouvais mettre un petit compteur derrière, pour faire un deuxième pour voir la seconde montre comme ça.
And he says, when I actually designed the Chronometre Optimum in 2001, I figured out that I could put another counter that would be visible from the case back, that would be visible from the back for deadbeat seconds, right? Which would be, of course, operated by the remontoir d'égalité, which is a 1 second remontoir, right? You know, releases that burst of energy every second.
Et j'ai dit, mais bon sang, je suis vraiment con parce que sur
to maintain that constant force.
Le premier tourbillon, le bracelet, j'ai pas pensé à la seconde montre.
So, en fait, c'est l'Optimum qui a donné les...
Oui.
Ah, bah, incroyable.
So, and in fact, that deadbeat second idea, he says, somehow didn't come up for him for the tourbillon wristwatch. And it was with Chronometre Optimum that he realized he could easily use the remontoir d'égalité for this deadbeat, for this jump seconds, for this ticking seconds display on the back of the watch, on the movement side of the watch.
Donc j'ai dessiné tout de suite le tourbillon ETN, nouveau. Et à la fin de 2003, j'ai stoppé le premier.
So with that design in 2001 of the Chronometre Optimum, he goes back immediately to his tourbillon, comes up with the caliber TN, tourbillon nouveau, which integrates this concept. And in 2003, he discontinues the first generation of the tourbillon wristwatch. And I think that that's very important when it comes to FP Journe, both from the perspective of not standing still, inventing constantly, in a horological sense, tinkering with certain technical aspects of his watches. This both is something very technical and practical, but it is also, I think, part of his marketing genius as well, part of his marketing angle, because once he revises something, he completely leaves behind what comes before. He doesn't return to it, which of course ends up retaining the value of those original versions, which represent, of course, the germination of an idea, and which are becoming more and more aspirational, both among long-standing collectors and people who are neophytes in this space, especially in the space for F.P. Journe watches. Nice to see you, man.
Oui. Ah ouais, c'est incroyable.
À cause de ça.
C'est l'Optimum que...
Oui, c'est pas le... On croirait que c'est l'inverse.
Ouais.
Et ça, je l'ai laissé 10 ans dans les tiroirs.
Oui.
So, it's natural to think, if you don't know what has been going on behind the scenes, Journe implies that you would think that I took the deadbeat seconds concept from the Tourbillon Nouveau and applied it to Chronomètre Optimum, whereas it was the other way around, because I have been thinking about and evolving that idea of a watch with double barrels, with remontoir d'égalité, with an escapement that doesn't need oil, and finally also with deadbeat seconds counter on the back of the watch, on the movement side of the watch. He says, I left the Chronomètre Optimum project in the drawer for 10 years.
Et puis en 2009, je crois, je commençais à dire, bon, il va falloir qu'on redessine tout, parce que notre savoir-faire s'est amélioré. Donc ce que j'avais dessiné en 2001,
So in 2009, since he thinks that they have superseded in terms of their know-how where they have been in 2001, he modifies, he renews the design for Chronomètre Optimum.
Il va falloir le modifier pour qu'il soit au niveau de ce qu'on fait aujourd'hui. Et après, c'est comme ça qu'on a sorti l'Optimum. Mais l'Optimum était déjà depuis... on l'a sorti en 2013, je crois.
Incroyable.
And I think Chronomètre Optimum came out in 2012, but F.P. Journe says here 2013. Anyways, I'm not always great with my memory, but we can double check which date is true. Yeah, 2012. He says 2013, but it was in 2012 when F.P. Journe released Chronomètre Optimum with the caliber 1510.
Et vous allez dire qu'à le moment, vous aurez pensé peut-être utiliser un échappement Robin, mais finalement, vous avez utilisé inspiré par l'échappement naturel.
Je vais te dire pourquoi j'ai pas fait Robin.
So Wei Ko goes back and asks, you said at some point you were thinking of utilizing échappement Robin, the Robin escapement, but now finally you have ended up utilizing a system that was inspired by the natural escapement, by Abraham Louis Breguet's original invention. Why? And François Paul Journe now goes on to explain why he didn't use the Robin escapement.
Parce qu'un jour, Giulio Papi m'a dit qu'il travaillait sur un échappement de Robin.
Giulio Papi a fait ça
Ouais.
pour son, oui.
Alors, je lui ai dit, écoute, je te laisse la priorité puisque tu as commencé avant moi.
Ok.
J'ai dit, je vais faire autre chose.
Ouais, incroyable.
At one point, he was having a conversation with Gillo Papi of the Renault et Papi fame, basically head of high horology or complications department at Audemars Piguet, you can say in another language. And that was an escapement that they ended up introducing for Audemars Piguet in 2006. And, to go very quickly, Robin takes its name after Robert Robin, and 18th century watchmaker who made a new escapement. He was a royal watchmaker to Louis XVI, which basically combined aspects of the Swiss escapement and the détente escapement, basically combining the efficiency of a détente escapement, which is usually used in pocket watches, with the Swiss lever escapement, which a lot of the modern wristwatches have integrated. Robin was not necessarily adopted widely because it was very sensitive to shocks. And so since F.P. Journe had that talk with Giulio Papi, who was already working on a modern interpretation of the Robin escapement, he said, well, you started with it first. You take it, I'll do something else, which is interesting, to say the least.
C'est un gentilhomme.
Oui, puis ça aurait été con qu'il y ait deux marques qui fassent la même chose.
Ouais.
Tu vois,
he says, well, I didn't necessarily do it out of charity or kindness, but I didn't want two brands to do the same thing, release the same kind of innovation. It would lack originality, so I moved on to something else, which again, I think is an ingenious way of pivoting to something else.
Ça manque d'originalité après.
Et pourquoi l'échappement naturel?
Parce que j'étais toujours fasciné par l'échappement naturel.
Moi aussi.
La première découverte que j'ai eue au Musée des Arts et Métiers.
Hey, EGD, respectos. Nice to see you. So he says, I did natural escapement because I was always fascinated by the natural escapements. I have seen it.
Par l'échappement naturel.
Moi aussi.
La première découverte que
I have first seen it in the Musée des Arts et des Métiers.
J'ai eu au Musée des Arts et Métiers lorsque on a travaillé là-bas. Moi, j'avais 20 ans, 20 et quelques. Mais j'avais bien appris la leçon de Breguet. Et puis, on a retrouvé dans les réserves.
He was 20 years old when he was in the museum. When he was working in his uncle's workshop in Paris, a lot of the work they were doing in that workshop, in that atelier, was restoring watches of this sort. And he says, already by the age of 20, I had studied Breguet pretty well, and we came across this hexagonal chronometer in the archives, in the reserves of the museum.
un chronomètre hexagonal, chronomètre de marine, de Breguet.
Oui.
Which was a marine chronometer made by Breguet.
Et puis, on ouvre pour regarder le mouvement.
Oui.
Il y avait mon oncle qui était là, il y avait Catherine Cardinal, il y avait Jean-Claude Saboyer.
We opened the watch to take a look at the movement. His uncle was there, apparently. Catherine Cardinal was there. Jean-Claude Sabrier was there.
Puis, oh, qu'est-ce que c'est cet échappement, tout ça, c'est incroyable cet échappement. Moi, je dis, mais c'est un échappement naturel. J'étais le seul à savoir ce que c'était.
And he was apparently the only one who recognized the natural escapement, whereas everyone else was, just wondering about what this incredible escapement was.
Donc, tu vois, je l'avais déjà appris depuis longtemps, l'échappement naturel.
Oui.
Ah ouais.
Et...
Mais après, le problème de l'échappement naturel, c'est que il n'est pas aussi perfectionné que celui-là. Parce que celui-là démarre tout seul, donc j'ai fait un truc. C'est un peu pareil, mais c'est un peu double impulsion sur le balancier.
Oui.
Ça, c'est le même.
So he wanted something that would start by itself. So he made something similar with double impulse on the balance.
Système. Ce sont les systèmes de repos et des palettes.
Oui.
Qui sont tout à fait différentes parce que sur l'échappement de. Le truc, c'est des palettes plates comme ça, tu sais, c'est une palette normalement qui fait.
Ah mais incroyable.
J'en ai un au bureau. Le truc,
oui.
Ça c'est le même système. Ce sont les systèmes de repos et des palettes.
Oui.
Qui sont tout à fait différentes parce que sur l'échappement de. Le truc, c'est des palettes plates. Sur l'échappement de repos et des palettes.
Oui.
Qui sont tout à fait différentes parce que sur l'échappement de. Le truc, c'est des palettes plates comme ça, tu sais, c'est une palette normalement qui fait.
Ah mais incroyable.
J'en ai un au bureau. C'était le reste que j'avais acheté avec Jean-Claude Saboyer de Journe.
So he basically, George Brown, the Brown family owned Breguet before the Chomet brothers took it over. So with Jean-Claude Sabrier, François-Paul Journe apparently purchased some stuff, including examples of the natural escapement from George Brown.
Celui qui avait racheté Breguet.
Oui, tout à fait.
Donc on avait racheté tout le lot, les documents, les trucs comme ça, avec Jean-Claude.
Along with all sorts of documents, and I'm sure not only limited to the natural escapement.
Wow. Et puis, après, il restait des bricoles comme ça.
C'est les roues de...
And apparently there were some loose ends to tie up, as he says, in a very abstract and general way. Waco asks if the wheels of the natural escapement are in titanium.
L'échappement naturel, c'est titane?
Non. Elles sont comme elles doivent être d'une perfection absolue, elles sont en nickel.
Nickel phosphorus.
Par Mimotech.
So to make them just perfect, he says, we made the wheels of the escapement from nickel phosphorus. It is by Mimotech, which makes the Omega Escape wheels.
Qui fait,
Omega, oui, ouais. C'est ça. Mais
parce que ça permet d'avoir
précision.
C'est-à-dire qu'en usinage, même si tu travailles bien, tu vas avoir le trou, le centre, qui risque d'être un petit peu décalé par rapport à quelques microns, ça suffit.
Ouais.
Alors que dans le procédé photographique de Mimotech, on arrive à avoir les pièces sont semblables.
Mais en matin, vous ne voulez pas utiliser silicium en fait?
Non, j'ai essayé. J'ai fait plein d'essais en silicium.
Ah oui?
Ouais.
He says I think Wei meant to ask in the sense that, are you resisting using silicium or silicon in the escapement? And François-Paul Journe says, I tried, but when you take the anchor out and put it back in, the wheel starts
Et
to
puis,
move.
quand tu enlèves une encre ou un truc, tu la remets, tu as la roue qui commence à démarrer. Tu touches à peine.
And, when at the slightest touch, it just goes.
Ça explose. Alors, je me suis dit, non, c'est pas jouable s'il y a un réparateur dans le futur qui veut toucher.
And that by the way, what he just said about, it's impossible really for someone to repair it in the future is the main reason for a lot of watchmakers, a lot of traditional watchmakers resist the use of silicon, even in escapements, but certainly also in balance springs, because you have a technology now, right, that has made hairsprings from transitional metals for such a long time, and you have watches from sometimes even more than a century ago that you can repair and restore and bring back to perfect condition. There's just no such guarantee when it comes to the use of silicon, right? Who will repair them, who will take care of them, how long they can actually survive. It's honestly, it's all a blur. And not only to me, I'm quite a commoner when it comes to watchmaking. I'm by no means a watchmaker myself, nor really an expert in the way that I would desire to be eventually. But it is these master watchmakers like Roger Smith, like François-Paul Journe, who have actually experimented with these things, who actually know what they're talking about, who are resisting it. Now, this is not a way to diss the use of silicon components in modern movements. Certainly, they do have certain important advantages in the way that they take the problem of magnetism out of the equation, which is great. Omega most recently has introduced a way to fine-tune their Spirit hairsprings, right? Their silicone hairsprings with the Spirit system. But with all these advancements, there's still no guarantee, there's still no established tradition among watchmakers of taking care of these watches, of being able to repair these watches in the same way that watches that have had transitional metal hairsprings have been repaired for centuries, basically, at this point.
C'est pas jouable pour ça.
Oui.
C'est un peu la méthode de Ferdinand Berthoud.
Oui.
Ferdinand Berthoud qui a jamais fait de tourbillon, bien sûr, contrairement à ce qu'on pourrait croire.
He says it's similar to Ferdinand Berthoud's method. And he says Ferdinand Berthoud never made a tourbillon, of course, contrary to what one might think. And that's a slight and a sly jab at Carl Friedrich Schäufele, of course, who has resurrected the Ferdinand Berthoud name as this quite rarefied and significant high horological laboratory in Fleurier. And as you know, the chapter 1 and chapter 2 were very much centered on the tourbillon for the releases from the renewed, revitalized Ferdinand Berthoud brand. So that's that is the inside joke there.
Faisait des chronomètres d'assez grande taille pour la marine.
Oui.
Et avec Jean-Claude Sabrier, on s'était toujours demandé pourquoi.
And so he's talking about Berthoud's heritage of making these marine chronometers for the Royal Navy. And François-Paul Journe says, I've always wondered with Jean-Claude Sabrier how it was so well done, how they were so reliable and so durable.
C'était si bien fait, oui, en fabrication, mais pourquoi il avait des choses, il utilisait des méthodes anciennes.
Oui.
And here's the key, right? You know, I said all these things, and François-Paul Journe is going to make it simple, which I think is a great testament to his outlook on watchmaking as well. Why was Ferdinand Berthoud using old methods in making his marine chronometers when he had certain technical advancements available to him? And that's a perfect analogy, of course, about watchmakers today, high horological or not, who are still sticking to movements, to calibers that don't make use, that don't avail themselves, that don't utilize extensively silicon components. And François-Paul Journe is using Ferdinand Berthoud's example to understand, well, to explain why he doesn't use silicon.
Alors qu'il aurait pu innover, parce qu'il y avait ce qu'il fallait. Et après, on a réfléchi, on est tombé d'accord sur le fait que un chronomètre qui voyage, qui traverse l'océan, oui, qui a besoin d'une révision de l'autre côté de la mer.
And, you know, again, he's giving an analogy to our horological world today, the state of the hobby today, which is very globalized, right? So here, Ferdinand Berthoud's chronometer is on a ship that crosses the seas, that transverses an ocean, and on the other end of that journey, it would need a repair. It might need, in fact, even an extensive overhaul, right? Because these are integral pieces of equipment for the ships at that time. That's the most precise instrument for navigation that you have. It is the marine chronometer. So when it comes to that period of time in the late 18th century, that's the kind of equipment you need. You know, you take it from one end of the journey, it has to last you through the journey, and it has to be simple enough. It has to be clear enough. It has to be relatively less complex so that a watchmaker at the other end of the world can repair it, can, if necessary, revise it and completely overhaul it. So there is a virtue in not overcomplicating things. There is a virtue of having a certain restraint in not adopting every single technical innovation willy-nilly just because it's the new shiny thing.
S'il est trop sophistiqué, tu peux pas le réparer. Et Berthoud voulait qu'il soit réparé.
Ah oui.
Donc il fallait garder des...
So the reliability of Berthoud's marine chronometers actually rested, François-Paul Journe explains, in the fact that they were made simple, using traditional methods, using traditional ways of constructing a chronometer in a way that was not overly sophisticated, that was not overly complicated, in a way that would be easily understood and approached and handled by a watchmaker in some other part of the world, because these things needed to be fixed and overhauled after every single journey, and they could not afford to be sophisticated and complicated just for the sake of it.
Des méthodes de construction,
oui,
que tout le monde puisse comprendre.
Ça, c'est incroyable. Ouais, parce que vous avez raison. Si on ne comprend pas...
Bah, tu vois, par exemple, si tu prends le chronomètre, les deux chronomètres de Pierre Leroy,
oui,
qui sont très fragiles.
Ah oui.
Parce qu'ils ont une compensation thermique avec des... qui sont très fragiles. Oui. Si tu prends le chronomètre, les deux chronomètres de Pierre Leroy,
oui,
qui sont très fragiles.
Ah oui.
Parce qu'ils ont une compensation thermique avec des espèces de...
And he gives the example for the more complicated chronometers. He gives the example of Leroy's two chronometers that are very fragile because they have a method of thermal compensation with tubes filled with mercury, all these pieces in glass.
De tubes remplis de mercure, tu sais, qui...
Oui, mercury.
Oui,
wow.
En verre. Tu vois. Mais partout, par contre, il y a la compensation sur le balancier.
Oui.
Alors ça, c'est en 1760.
Oui.
Et c'est un échappement à détente, déjà. Mais qui, au lieu de travailler sur l'axe, travaille sur l'extérieur, sur la serge du balancier.
And he gives also the example of the détente escapement, which instead of working on the axis of the balance, works on the outside, on the balance collar.
Donc, là-dedans, tu as la préfiguration de l'horlogerie moderne. Mais trop tôt.
And in a way, you have, he says, the prefiguration of modern watchmaking, but perhaps too ahead of its time, because it is too complicated for everyone to handle, for everyone to be able to fix.
Trop tôt pour faire un chronomètre stabilisé pour en cas de risque de... Il avait mis déjà les rubis, il avait mis tout ça. Mais si tu as un rubis qui est fêlé de l'autre côté, c'est impossible.
And again, you know, he was using rubies as pivots and everything, but what if one cracked and they are already on the other side of the ocean? What are they going to do? Right? So it was a little too ahead of its time when it comes to Leroy's chronometers. And he says the reason Berthoud left such a strong legacy is because he did not overcomplicate things, because he used simple traditional construction methods. And that is his model when he was approaching the problem of a natural escapement for chronomètre optimum.
C'est pas de rubis. Oui. Il mettait ses galets, ces trucs comme ça, oui, pour diminuer les frottements, mais il mettait pas de galets.
Pas incroyable.
Il y a toujours des méthodes de travail. Et celui qui a vraiment inventé après le chronomètre moderne, c'est son neveu, c'est Louis. Berthoud.
And he says it was actually the nephew of Ferdinand Berthoud, Louis Berthoud, who invented the modern chronometer.
Ah oui. Mais j'ai jamais pensé de ça, mais en fait, c'est extraordinaire.
C'est Louis Berthoud,
oui,
qui a fait les premiers. Et puis après, par son élève, ça a été l'apothéose, c'est avec Henri Motel.
Okay.
Henri Motel, c'est lui qui a fait le plus beau chronomètre.
And he describes this lineage of Ferdinand Berthoud, his nephew Louis Berthoud, and his student Henri Motel, who François-Paul Journe says made the most beautiful chronometers. And he was the apotheosis of modern chronometer. He said, let's see how he explains that.
Et puis après, il y a un autre fou qui venait de l'Europe de l'Est qui s'appelait Wienerl, Théodus Wienerl. Et lui, il a fait dans la simplicité des choses. Alors, c'est pas de l'esbroufant, on comprend rien quand on regarde. On comprend rien.
Oui.
Enfin, c'est pas spectaculaire,
oui,
mais c'est efficace.
And then he talks about how Wienerl, who was an Eastern European, he says, who came and made something very simple, not necessarily spectacular, but effective. And he is focusing on that necessity of efficiency when it comes to the chronometer beyond the spectacle, which is something he's also invested in, of course, elsewhere perhaps, but not necessarily when the primary aim is reliability, durability, accuracy, and precision.
Incroyable.
Parce qu'il faut savoir que après que Breguet, dans les années 1810, parce qu'il y avait Berthoud, puis après c'est Breguet qui avait la charge de l'horlogerie de la marine. Ensuite, c'était Berthoud, puis après c'est Breguet.
Incroyable.
Parce qu'il faut savoir que après que Breguet, dans les années 1810, parce qu'il y avait Berthoud, puis après c'est Breguet qui avait la charge de l'horlogerie de la marine. Ensuite, c'était terminé.
So it was first Berthoud and then Breguet, who were the official horologists, official chronometer makers for the Navy, and then it stopped, and then the Navy put it up for competition after that ceased.
La Marine royale a mis au concours.
Oui.
Donc tous les horlogers pouvaient se présenter au concours.
Oui.
Alors il y a eu 5-6 horlogers qui étaient fabricants de chronomètres.
And that was a competition that everyone could participate. So there were about 5 or 6 watchmakers who made these marine chronometers.
Incroyable. Et François, je voulais vous demander, pourquoi est-ce que c'est important pour vous de discontinuer des modèles certains? Par exemple, la première version de tourbillon, la première version de la résonance.
Ouais.
Parce que vous pouvez bien sûr vendre ces modèles pour...
Oui, je sais.
Waco asks that important question, which I was also thinking about already at the beginning, right? Why is it important for you to release these new models for the tourbillon, for the chronomètre à résonance? Because clearly you could sell the same model based on the same caliber for the next century without revising or modifying it in any way. And François-Paul Journe says, of course, I know.
De son temps,
Ouais, mais enfin, moi, mon plaisir, c'est de travailler. Alors, si j'ai rien à faire.
He says, I take pleasure in my work. What if I don't have anything to do?
Mais je le fais pas si j'ai pas une idée. Tu vois. Par exemple, actuellement, je travaille sur un échappement.
And he says, if I don't continue working, I don't have an idea, right? And that's kind of hidden in the motto he has for the brand, right? Invenit et fecit, right? Invented or discovered and made. So he has to constantly find ways of innovating, but innovating things that are applicable, that he is able to implement, that he is actually able to manufacture. And that goes back into what he described in a rather complicated way, this idea that he admires in the horological heritage, specifically of marine chronometers made by Ferdinand Berthoud, in that they are simple, traditionally made, without overcomplicating things, and that gives them lasting value because they could be handled, taken care of, fixed, and revised by generations of watchmakers.
Bon.
Oui.
Alors, on en a parlé, mais il n'est pas encore au point.
And he is currently working on a new escapement, and he says him and Waco have already talked about it, but it has not been perfected yet.
Si j'arrive à le mettre au point, il ira progressivement dans toutes les montres.
And if I succeed in perfecting it, if I succeed in developing it, it will gradually be presented in all the models across the entire range of FB Journe watches.
Ça, c'est cool. Ça, c'est vraiment cool. C'est quel design de échappement?
Il est tellement petit que tu le vois pas.
What kind of escapement design is that? Waco asks. And François-Paul Journe says it's so small that you can't see it.
Mais c'est un dérivé de l'échappement à détente.
Ah, cool.
Mais entièrement libre.
Completely free, but derivative of the détente escapement.
Wow.
C'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a plus de ressort. Tout ce qui fait qu'un échappement à détente est pas assez performant.
Ouais.
So there would be no spring. He says everything that makes the détente escapement perform well.
Je l'ai enlevé.
Wow.
I took out.
C'est pas comme vous avez fait avec l'échappement naturel ici.
Non, non.
Non?
Non, non.
And Wei asks, is that the same thing as you did with the natural escapement? He says no.
Non, parce que l'échappement naturel, je pouvais le mettre que dans cette montre qui est assez épaisse. Je ne peux pas le mettre dans une.
The natural escapement, he could only put in a watch that's as thick as the chronometer optimum, right? Because he's trying to, we have talked about this in another context, he is trying to keep his watches as thin as possible with a sleek profile as is humanly possible. That's, for example, why he doesn't usually use enamel dials for watches, right? He only has the enamel dial in that vertical tourbillon, for example, because the watch is already thick to accommodate the vertical placement of the tourbillon. He could use enamel. So the natural escapement is only used in chronometer optimum because it simply wouldn't fit in the Octa or chronometre souverain case as they currently are. And he doesn't want to sacrifice the profile of the watches as they exist now. So he is designing an escapement that would fit across the range into all his watches without taking away from their current design.
Une octave dans un chronomètre souvent.
Ah, ok.
Donc, il a fallu que je cherche autre chose.
Oui.
Plus simple, mais plus efficace.
Incroyable.
So he contends that this new escapement is both more efficient and simpler than what came before, than his natural escapement, for sure. It is going to be derivative of a détente escapement, but free sprung, and not in need of a spring.
Alors, probablement que si j'arrive à le faire marcher.
Ouais.
Bon, il fonctionne, hein, la montre tourne, tout ça.
Incroyable.
Mais je comprends pas pourquoi je perds des secondes.
Ah oui.
He says, I've made the watch run with this new escapement, but I just don't know why it keeps losing seconds. I can't figure out how.
Et comme
I
c'est un
can't
échappement
understand.
spécial que les appareils de contrôle ne comprennent pas très bien,
Ouais.
mais enfin, je vois qu'il perd parce que un jour il va rien perdre et puis le lendemain il va perdre.
Ouais.
And he says, I also can't necessarily home into the problem because it is not an escapement system that could be easily understood by the control devices as we have them. Some days it doesn't lose, some days it loses some seconds.
Et c'est pas l'effet du spiral, c'est l'effet de quelque chose qui se passe dedans.
And it's not the effect of the spiral, and it's something else that is going on there that he clearly hasn't figured out yet.
Que j'ai disséqué 4 fois, j'ai fait 4 étapes déjà. Et j'arrive pas à régler ce problème. Ça viendra.
And he says he basically took it apart 4 times, went through the steps 4 times, but he can't figure out the problem. He says, but it will come to me. It's good to have some sort of confidence in oneself.
Je suis sûr. Je peux vous demander sur le...
And Wei says, I'm sure it will. And finally, he's asking about the vertically placed 30-second tourbillon that I was just talking about, which also is, thanks to its thickness for accommodating that tourbillon, is the only watch, in my knowledge. I'm sure there can be some, bespoke or limited edition somewhere, but in my knowledge, that's the only FB Journe watch that has an enamel dial, which he thinks his other watches in their existing profile don't accommodate. So the 30-second tourbillon.
Le tourbillon, position verticale, 30 secondes. Pourquoi ça vous inspire de...
Alors parce que j'avais toujours un problème avec l'ancien tourbillon.
What inspired you to make the vertically placed 30-second tourbillon? And François-Paul Journe says, I've always had this problem with the older tourbillon.
Lorsque quelqu'un, un client me disait, bon, moi je vais mettre une boucle déployante.
Oui. Ah, ok.
Alors je savais qu'il le mettait comme ça la nuit.
Oui.
He says some clients wanted to put it on déployant clasp, and I know they are going to put the watch on its side when it's on a déployant clasp, rather than laying it out, when the watch is on a tang buckle.
Ah. Et le frottement sur un tourbillon horizontal change totalement, et la marche aussi.
And of course, on a horizontal tourbillon, placing the watch on the side like that changes the friction, changes its functioning.
Alors que là, c'est toujours la même chose.
Ouais. Incroyable.
But in the case of the vertically placed tourbillon, he says it's still the same thing. And this is that beautiful watch. By the way, I think, if I'm not mistaken, just last week, a version of this Journe vertical tourbillon was sold in Geneva. It wasn't part of I don't think it was part of the Art of FB Journe auction. Possibly. Possibly the other Geneva auction by Christie's. Let me check it very quickly. Okay, I do want to see how this went. Absolutely. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Couldn't find it, but I'm almost sure something like this sold very recently, unless I am mixing it up with something listed in Hong Kong, which is very possible. Let me just quickly look at that. And yes, all right. It is actually lot number 2541 from the Ultimate Collection auction that is coming up in Hong Kong. Oops. There is a version of this vertical tourbillon watch that is going to be on sale. Enamel dial, vertically placed 30-second tourbillon with a constant force mechanism, a remontoir d'égalité, and the deadbeat seconds. And this piece has an estimate which at the lower end is around, well, in excess of $230,000. So that's what they are talking about right now.
Incroyable. Et version, la nouvelle version, de résonance.
C'était améliorer c'est-à-dire que bon, il y avait le remontoir ici.
And he's talking about now the new version of chronometre résonance, and he says a lot of people didn't like the placement of the second crown, since the watch has again two separate movements, separate gear trains, separate escapements, and in this case also separate remontoir d'égalité as well.
Et les gens n'aimaient pas trop. Alors j'ai mis le remontoir ici, mais pour pouvoir mettre un remontoir pour remonter ici et garder un mouvement qui soit.
And I really like the fact that the symmetry of the watch face has been restored, right? You now have the two dials, the 12-hour dial and the 24-hour dial, kind of overlapping, tangentially touching each other. And that's I think much more charming. I think symmetry is key when it comes to watches like this that have traditionally busy dials.
Pas trop. Alors j'ai mis le remontoir ici, mais pour pouvoir mettre un remontoir pour remonter ici et garder un mouvement qui soit.
And again, that same kind of balance is, of course, reflected on the movement side as well, with the two movements placed in close proximity so that they resonate with each other, so that they compensate for each other's errors, basically, and end up synchronizing, as you have seen in terms of these two small seconds hands.
Pour remonter ici et garder un mouvement qui soit équilibré dans la ligne.
Oui.
And the challenge was, of course, as he was changing the placement of the crown, he still wanted to preserve the symmetry that I was just talking about on the movement side, right? So it is, honestly, it is a design principle that he wouldn't want to give up, because that's one of the most distinctive things, I believe, about his watches, that they look not only simply beautiful inside and out, front and back, but also very balanced, and mostly in a largely symmetrical way. And if that symmetry is put out of balance, there is usually a legitimate reason, so to speak.
Je pouvais plus mettre de barillet, donc il a fallu que je mette un seul barillet. Après, j'ai dû mettre pour partager la force de droite à gauche, faire un différentiel.
Oui. Ah, ok, maintenant je comprends. Ça, c'est le différentiel pour les deux trains.
Alors, tu as une seule force, un différentiel, puis après,
double remontoir d'égalité.
Deux remontoirs d'égalité pour arriver à la meilleure performance.
Incroyable.
And the power derives from a single barrel, so that's pretty impressive for the two separate movements.
C'est incroyable pour moi, parce que quand j'ai vu l'architecture de votre mouvement, je trouve tellement belle, mais je pense que vous commencez avec les cadrans toujours.
Oui, toujours.
Bah, c'est incroyable que vous pouvez faire des mouvements comme ça quand vous commencez avec les cadrans.
Oui, mais je sais ce que je mets en même temps derrière.
That's very funny, because Wei was asking, I was always amazed that you start your design with the dials, and Weiko says it's really impressive that you come up with these symmetrical movements as well, but obviously from the mind of a watchmaker who also knows a thing or two about the design, it's not a binary opposition. It's not it's not a process that is actually so schizoid, right? You know, he in fact knows what he is going to put behind that dial as he is designing the dial. So obviously, even though the design for François-Paul Journe starts with the dial, he knows how the movement layout has to be as he is putting that together.
C'est pas que je fais le cadran comme un enfant et puis après je dis qu'est-ce que je vais faire derrière.
Excellent.
Non, puis là je joue avec la lumière.
It's not like it's not like I put I just sketch something like a child would draw and then try to figure out what I'm going to put behind as a movement. So obviously he's making light of a very complex process, but his mind clearly can work in both those dimensions at the same time: aesthetic and horological, design oriented and technically grounded, even if he's looking at the watch face first, from the dial first. And he says, I play with the light as well, that he actually wants to think about reflections, how the dial would reflect and absorb light.
Lumière aussi, quand tu regardes ça, si tu regardes complètement perpendiculaire, tu vois un balancier horizontal qui tourne.
Ah oui, c'est ça. Ah bah c'est incroyable.
And of course, the vertical tourbillon piece is a great example of that, with that beautifully mirror polished ring that puts the tourbillon at the focal point of the watch, but also puts particular focus on the
Complètement
horizontal
perpendiculaire, tu vois un balancier
pendulum.
horizontal qui tourne.
Ah oui, c'est ça. Ah bah c'est incroyable.
T'as l'impression de voir le balancier.
Oui, exactement.
C'est fait exprès, ça m'amuse.
Ah ouais. Ah mais c'est cool. Incroyable. François, merci beaucoup.
Merci à toi.
C'est vraiment gentil. Je comprends maintenant beaucoup plus que votre vision de l'horlogerie.
This is the expressions of gratitude, and I think it's well deserved. Waco did an amazing work. He has had interviews with all manner of watchmakers and leaders of the industry, but I think this is really a masterpiece. Of course, the documentary that he did on De Bethune, going to the manufacturer, interviewing Denis Flageolet and Pierre-Jacques, the brand CEO, extensively. That was great too. But this retrospective, I think, was both a great way to think about François-Paul Journe as a man, as a watchmaker, through his journey, through his trajectory, and also to think more cohesively, more coherently about the catalog of the brand, about FP Journe's offerings, both through the years and currently. So I think this was great work. I highly recommend that you watch all the 3 parts. If you would be interested, I can do a more focused episode where I think do a little less of the pause Andy thing, where we can go through all 3 parts, and I will only stop to respond to your questions, perhaps. I can do that if anyone wants it. If that's what you would like, please send me an email and let me know. You can, of course, find me on Instagram as well. And that is young.brando. I'm going to put the link in the chat. So write to me if you would like to have a more coherent episode on this, where I don't do this start-stop thing, and we will only stop when you have questions, because I think it was very valuable, and it was incredible work by Waco to put together such a thoughtful interview in 3 parts that was very focused, but also extremely detailed at the same time.
Ouais. Tu sais, l'esthétique, c'est la lumière. C'est comme un peintre, hein, je fais pareil. Ouais. Bon, nous, on a des matériaux qui...
And he's talking at the end about basically his artistic vision. He says, aesthetics is all about light. I approach it just like a painter. And yes, it can sound conceited. And yes, François-Paul Journe has said things like this in the past. You know, buy my watches before I pass away, because they will be worth even more. That statement was precisely speaking to the heart of this idea that he's an artist, and he's saying it in a very specific way now, that as watchmakers, just like painters, they make objects, material objects that make reflections in space, and some that make less reflections, and it's all about arranging that interplay between reflection and absorption for his design process, for his aesthetic vision.
Font des reflets, puis d'autres que tu fais moins de reflets, tout ça. C'est tout ce mélange de reflets et pas de reflets qui font que tu animes un petit théâtre. Un petit théâtre avec et qui fonctionne.
Et qui fonctionne très bien. Ouais. Je suis sûr que si...
And he basically says by combining those elements, combining materials that reflect light, that absorb light, and putting them into a certain tension, into a certain interplay with each other, we end up putting some sort of spirit into the process, right? Making sure that you have a little bit of play, a little bit of a theatrical presentation almost for a watch, which of course is also a mechanism that works. And in F.B. Journe's case, they work well and often with chronometric precision and accuracy. And Wei will say at the end that once again, if we can imagine the horological legacy as a great wall, François-Paul Journe has laid perhaps one of the important stones or bricks in the construction of the wall. This is the analogy that Waco likes to use, and I think it is very apt indeed.
Ici, l'horlogerie, c'est un mur. Vous allez mettre peut-être le plus grand pièce dans la mur. So, merci beaucoup, François-Paul. C'est un très grand plaisir.
Merci, oui.
Cheers.
All right. So this was my episode for today. I think I will come with the late show in a little more than 6 hours. It will be our usual process. I will talk about auctions. I will talk about some new releases, perhaps, and I will see you back then. If you want to support the channel, you know how. All the information is included in the video description, and it is in the rolling ticker now. I am also putting the links into the chat. Feel free to contribute in any way. As you know, this channel is fully independent and autonomous and entirely at the service of its viewers. So any support, any contribution is very much appreciated, and it goes directly back to the channel to make it more self-sustaining, more long-standing, and more diversified and rich in content. Please hit the like button on the way out. I look forward to seeing you soon. Until then, I bid you adieu. Take care.